Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. The Echo of the Dead. The woods didn't have a name. Not one anyone used, anyway. Locals just called it the Pines, a stretch of forest with trees so thick they blotted out the sky. In the daytime, the air smelled of pine needles and damp earth. At night, it smelled like fear. Maggie leaned over the fire, poking at the embers with a stick. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice low. Brandon looked up from his marshmallow, which was steadily dripping onto the dirt. "Hear what? Probably just a coyote or something." "No," Maggie said, frowning. It sounded like whispering. The group fell silent. Only the crackle of the fire and the distant hoot of an owl broke the stillness. Jenna, always the skeptic, rolled her eyes. "You're imagining things. You've been on edge since we got here." Maggie's frown deepened, but she didn't argue. Maybe Jenna was right. Maybe it was just her imagination. Or maybe it was something else. The Pines had a reputation. Back in the 1970s, a group of teenagers had camped here on a dare. According to the story, one of them accidentally knocked over a lantern, sparking a fire that trapped them all. By the time anyone found them, it was too late. The fire had consumed the campsite and the campers. Some folks said you could still hear their screams on quiet nights. Others claimed they'd seen shadowy figures moving between the trees. But those were just stories. At least, that's what Maggie kept telling herself. "Let's tell ghost stories," Brandon suggested, breaking the uneasy silence. He grinned, trying to lighten the mood. "We're already out here. Might as well go full horror movie." "Hard pass," Maggie said. "This place is creepy enough without us scaring ourselves stupid." "Ah, come on," Jenna said, smirking. "You scared, Maggie?" Maggie glared at her. "No, I just don't think it's a good idea." "Let's vote," Brandon said. "Who wants ghost stories?" 3 hands shot up: Brandon, Jenna, and Kyle. Maggie groaned. "Fine, but don't say I didn't warn you." The first story was silly. Something about a haunted doll that didn't even make sense. The second was better. A classic urban legend about a hook-handed killer. By the time Brandon started his story, the fire had burned down to glowing coals, casting flickering shadows on the trees. "So," Brandon began, his voice low and dramatic, "there was this group of friends camping in the woods." "Original," Jenna muttered, earning a laugh from Kyle. Brandon ignored her. "They were sitting around the fire, just like us, and then they started hearing whispers. At first they thought it was the wind, but then the whispers got louder, closer, like they were coming from right behind them." Maggie shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. The air felt colder all of a sudden, and then Brandon continued, leaning forward. They realized they weren't alone. A loud crack echoed through the forest. Everyone jumped. Maggie's heart hammered in her chest as she looked around. "What was that?" "Probably just a branch," Kyle said, though his voice wavered. Or the wind, Jenna added, but even she didn't sound convinced. Brandon grinned. See? Perfect atmosphere for a ghost story. The whispers started after midnight. Soft at first, barely audible over the crackle of the dying fire. Maggie sat bolt upright in her sleeping bag, her ears straining. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. Brandon stirred, groaning. "Go to sleep, Maggie." "No," she insisted. "Listen." This time, Brandon heard it too. A faint, murmuring sound, like voices carried on the wind. He sat up, his face pale. "What the hell is that?" The others woke up one by one, each of them hearing the whispers. They huddled together, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. But the light only seemed to make the shadows deeper, the trees more menacing. "Hello," Kyle called, his voice trembling. "Is anyone out there?" The whispers grew louder, closer, and then they could make out words. "Help us." Maggie's blood ran cold. "No," she whispered. "This isn't happening. We have to leave," Jenna said, her voice sharp with panic. "Now." They scrambled to pack their things, their hands shaking. But as they moved, the whispers turned into cries, pleading, desperate. "Stay with us." The fire flared suddenly, blazing high and bright. In its glow, they saw them, shadowy figures standing just beyond the trees. Their faces were pale and gaunt, their eyes hollow, and they were watching. "Run!" Brandon screamed. They bolted, leaving their gear behind. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees twisting and bending as if to trap them. The whispers followed, growing louder with every step. Finally, they burst out of the woods, panting and terrified. The whispers stopped. The night was silent. The next morning, the group returned with the local sheriff. But when they reached the campsite, it was gone. No fire pit, no tents, no trace that anyone had ever been there. Only a faint smell of smoke lingered in the air, and the whispers, faint but unmistakable, carried on the wind. "Help us." Story 2. The Red Lantern. The road to the old camping site was no longer on the map, but Maggie had heard about it from a friend who swore by its beauty. After years of work, the Bailey family had finally found the time to get away. No distractions, no cell phones, just a weekend in the woods to clear their heads. So, when Maggie's friend described it as a secret spot, quiet, hidden, and perfect, they were sold. "You sure this is the right way?" Mark asked, peering through the windshield at the thick woods lining the dirt road. "It's just a little further," Maggie said, turning the steering wheel with determination. "You'll see. We're almost there." Maggie had always been the planner of the family, especially when it came to vacations. Mark, her husband, was the type to put on a pair of boots and just let the weekend happen. But this time, he trusted her judgment. And why not? The kids were excited, their faces lit up with the idea of adventure. Sam, their oldest at 14, and Emily, only 9, had their noses pressed against the windows, eyes scanning for deer, or any sign of wildlife. It wasn't long before the path narrowed, the trees closing in around them like dark sentinels. Maggie glanced at the map. There was no trail here, no markings. The trailhead was more of a suggestion than an actual road, but she was convinced this was it. The sun was low, casting long shadows through the trees when they reached the clearing. The campsite looked abandoned, untouched. There were no other cars, no signs of human life, just the faint remnants of a campfire, cold and charred. "This is it," Maggie said, pulling the Jeep to a stop. "Let's set up camp." The family unloaded their gear and started assembling the tents. There was a strange quiet, an almost oppressive stillness in the air. Even the birds seemed to have stopped chirping. The wind barely moved the leaves, but Maggie didn't let it bother her. She was too used to the outdoors to feel uncomfortable. As dusk settled in, the family huddled around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and telling jokes. Mark cracked a few, making the kids laugh, but something kept tugging at the edges of Maggie's mind. Then she noticed them in the trees, just beyond the campsite. There were 5 red lanterns hanging from the branches, swaying gently in the wind. They were old-fashioned, the kind you only saw in antique shops, casting an eerie glow in the growing darkness. "Mark, do you see those?" Maggie asked, her voice tight. He looked up and squinted. "Must be left by other campers, maybe." "No way. I've never seen anything like that before," Maggie said, standing up. "I'm going to take a look." Sam and Emily followed her. The lanterns were spaced out along the tree line, each one glowing brighter as they got closer. The air around them seemed to feel colder. The fire behind them crackled, but it wasn't enough to shake the growing unease. "What are these doing here?" Sam asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He tugged at Maggie's sleeve. "Mom, it feels weird. They're probably just decorations," Maggie said, but she didn't sound convinced. As they reached the first lantern, Maggie noticed something odd. There was no fuel in it, no wick, no way for the light to be coming from within. But it glowed all the same, casting long shadows on the ground. Maggie reached out, her fingers hovering just above the metal frame. But before she could touch it, a chill shot down her spine. "Mom, look," Emily whispered, her eyes wide. Maggie turned, following the little girl's trembling finger. Her breath caught in her throat. At the edge of the clearing stood a man. He wasn't moving, just watching them. His clothes were tattered, and his face was pale as bone. There was something deeply wrong about him. His eyes hollow, like they'd seen too much. And yet, it wasn't his appearance that froze Maggie in place. It was the fact that he was standing right where the red lanterns had been hanging. "Maggie, let's go," Mark said, his voice tight with fear. He was standing behind them now, holding Emily close. The man took a slow step toward them, and that was enough. Maggie grabbed Sam's arm, pulling him away from the lanterns, her heart pounding in her chest. "Get back to the campsite now," Mark shouted. They ran. As they neared the fire, Maggie dared to look back. The man was gone, But the lanterns were still there, 5 of them, swaying gently in the wind. The family huddled around the fire, the flames casting frantic shadows as the night pressed in. No one spoke. The atmosphere felt thick, suffocating, and when Maggie glanced over her shoulder, she could still see the faint glow of the lanterns, like eyes watching them from the dark. Mark grabbed her hand. Maggie, we're leaving. Now, just wait, she said, voice shaking. I need to know what's going on. But deep down, she already knew. This place wasn't just forgotten, it was cursed. And the man they'd seen, he wasn't just a ghost. He was part of something darker, something tied to the lanterns, to the unsolved murder that had never left these woods. It was only after the family packed up and left, when they drove out of the forest and back onto the main road, that Maggie saw the last lantern. It was hanging on a post just off the trail they had followed in. A single red lantern swaying gently in the wind, and beneath it, etched in the wood, were the words, "Find the truth, or it will find you." The Baileys never spoke of that night again, but sometimes, when Maggie closes her eyes, she can still hear the faint whisper of lanterns in the wind, and she knows whatever was waiting in the woods had already found them. Story 3. The Creature Below. The sun had barely set when Megan, Noah, and Jack set up camp beside the hidden lake. The place was so remote, tucked deep in the woods, they had to follow a barely there trail marked only by faded blazes on trees. They had heard whispers about the lake. The locals called it Blackwater. But the stories, like all the good ghost stories, were dismissed as just that, stories. But even now, as the 3 of them sat around the fire, roasting marshmallows and telling jokes, the woods felt wrong. The air was too still, too heavy. The lake, dark and smooth as glass, seemed to swallow the fading light, hiding whatever lurked beneath. And though the stars shone bright above them, there was a quiet hum in the air, a strange buzzing noise that made Megan uneasy. "Isn't it beautiful?" Noah asked, breaking the silence. He leaned back, staring at the glimmering surface of the lake, his feet kicked up on a rock. Jack, poking at the fire with a stick, gave a half-hearted nod. "Yeah, if you like creepy places." "Creepy?" Megan frowned, glancing nervously at the water. The wind had picked up, making the branches above them creak. "It's just a lake. You two are acting like little kids. You've heard the stories, right?" Noah said, his voice lowering, like he was trying to be ominous. "The ones about Blackwater?" Megan rolled her eyes. "Seriously? You two still believe in that nonsense?" Noah leaned forward, his eyes shining. "I don't believe it, but they say if you camp here, and you're stupid enough to swim in the lake, well, something might grab you, pull you under. You disappear like you never existed. They say the lake takes your soul." Jack snorted. "Right? And how do they know that?" Noah shrugged. "I don't know, but I've heard enough stories from people who've camped here over the years. It's a place you don't mess with." Megan laughed it off, but a shiver ran down her spine. "It's just a lake, guys. You're both way too into this whole ghost story thing. As darkness fully descended, the trio settled into their tents, and the sounds of the forest filled the night. Crickets, the rustling of leaves, the occasional hoot of an owl. But there was something else, something beneath it all, a faint, rhythmic noise, like breathing. Megan couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, waiting. She pulled her blanket tighter around her and closed her eyes, trying to ignore it. Around 3 a.m., Megan woke up with a start. Her breath hitched as the sound grew louder. It wasn't the wind anymore. There was something moving in the water. Her heart pounded as she sat up, wiping the sweat from her brow. Outside, it was pitch black, save for the faint glow of the fire they'd left burning low. She opened the flap of her tent and stepped out into the cool night air, shivering. She couldn't see anything, but the water, black water, was different. It was alive. The surface was rippling, though there was no wind. It was as if something was shifting beneath. Megan. Jack's voice cracked through the silence. She turned to find him standing near the fire, staring at the lake, his face pale. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, his voice tight with fear. She nodded, unable to find her voice. Then, the water gave a strange, deep lurch. It was like something huge had just shifted below the surface. For a moment, the lake was still again, but then, slowly, something began to rise. A form, dark, massive, its shape distorted by the shadows of the trees. "No!" Jack shouted, but his voice was swallowed by the hum in the air. The creature, if it even was a creature, rose higher, its form undulating with unnatural grace. The water seemed to part for it, and Megan's stomach twisted. Then it made a sound, a low, rumbling growl, but not from anywhere above the surface. It was coming from below, from the very depths of the lake. Noah stumbled out of his tent, his eyes wide with panic. "What the hell is that?" Megan's breath hitched as she realized that they weren't alone. Not anymore. Something was watching them. Something ancient. And it was hungry. The creature, no, the thing, rose fully from the water. It was enormous, its shape amorphous, with long, twisted limbs that seemed to stretch out, reaching for them. The hum in the air grew louder, almost deafening. "Run!" Noah screamed, but the creature was faster. It lurched toward them, and in a blink, its long fingers shot out, wrapping around Jack's waist. He screamed, but the sound was muffled as he was dragged toward the water. "No, Jack!" Megan screamed, but it was too late. The creature pulled him beneath the surface with a terrible, final splash. Megan and Noah stumbled backward, their feet tangling in the soft earth as they scrambled toward their bags, toward the woods. But the thing wasn't finished. The lake, once still, began to ripple again, like it was rising, like it was swallowing the whole world. Megan looked at Noah. Desperation and fear painted across both their faces. There was no way out. They were too close to the water now. The creature's tendrils were already reaching for them, slow and purposeful. "Noah, it's going to take us too." Megan screamed, but Noah's eyes were wide with horror. It's too late. There's nowhere to run. It won't let us go. Megan's heart was in her throat as the thing surged forward. She could see it now, its face, or what passed for one. Hollow eyes, a mouth full of jagged, broken teeth, and a grin that would haunt her for eternity. "Please," she cried out, but the creature was already pulling her towards the water. It didn't care about please. It was ancient, and it was hungry. The last thing Megan saw before the water swallowed her whole was Noah, screaming, his eyes locked with hers as the darkness claimed them both. And from that moment on, the lake was no longer silent. The next morning, the campsite was abandoned. The fire had burned out. The tents were empty, their flaps flapping weakly in the wind. The only sign that anyone had ever been there were 3 sets of footprints leading toward Blackwater. Footprints that stopped at the water's edge. And as the sun rose, the surface of the lake was still. But deep below, something shifted. Story 4. Shadow Camp. The forest wasn't supposed to be dangerous. It was just a patch of woods tucked behind a sleepy lake, a place where people went to get away from their hectic lives. No one thought there was anything unusual about the weathered campsite. An old fire ring, a few picnic tables, and that faint smell of damp earth that seemed to hang in the air. But when Ethan, Sarah, and Luke pitched their tents that weekend, they unknowingly crossed into something darker than they could have imagined. It was Ethan who first noticed it, the shadows. At first, they seemed like an ordinary trick of the light. As the sun began to sink behind the trees, long, dark shadows stretched across the ground, twisting and bending in strange ways. Ethan turned to Sarah, who was adjusting her sleeping bag. "Did you see that?" he asked, his voice low. "See what?" Sarah glanced up. He pointed to their shadows, cast sharply against the pale dirt of the campsite. His shadow, it didn't quite match his movements. It jerked and swayed unnaturally, as if it were dancing to a rhythm only it could hear. Ethan frowned, rubbed his eyes, and watched it again. This time, it was clear. The shadow of his arm raised when his own arm stayed still. I'm not imagining this," he whispered. "What are you talking about?" Sarah asked, but her voice trembled. She looked at her own shadow. It was shifting too. Her feet remained planted on the ground, but her shadow walked a few steps ahead, then stopped. It paused, then glanced over its shoulder, staring at her as if waiting for her to follow. Luke, sitting by the fire, noticed their unease. "What's up with you two?" "The shadows," Sarah muttered, her eyes wide. "They're moving." Luke chuckled. "It's just the firelight. It plays tricks on you." But Sarah wasn't laughing. Her hand gripped Ethan's arm. "No, Luke, look at yours." Luke followed her gaze, his brow furrowing. His shadow, thin and lanky, just like him, was stretching unnaturally along the dirt. It reached out, creeping slowly toward the forest line, as if it had a mind of its own. "Okay, that's freaky," he said, standing up, The shadow didn't follow his movement immediately. Instead, it stayed where it was, as if anchored to the ground. The breeze picked up, rustling the trees overhead. The fire crackled, but the shadows, they grew, spreading across the campsite in unnatural shapes. Sarah's shadow twisted, stretching out like a long arm, trying to pull away from her. Ethan reached out, desperate to grab it, but the shadow slipped away, skittering across the dirt as if it were trying to run. "Something's wrong," Ethan said, panic rising in his chest. "It's the woods. It's the forest. It's alive." The ground beneath them seemed to hum with energy. The air grew heavier, as if the night itself were holding its breath. They stood there, frozen, eyes wide as the forest whispered, something low, something dark, like a voice carried on the wind. The shadows began to merge, stretching and distorting in impossible shapes. Figures, dark, indistinct, flitted at the edges of the firelight, their movements erratic, as though they were trying to escape the confines of the trees. Ethan's heart raced. "We need to leave. Now." They turned to pack, but the ground beneath them was shifting. The dirt seemed to ripple, as if the earth itself was waking up. Each time they moved, their shadows stayed behind, creeping toward the shadows of the trees, drawn like magnets. It wasn't just that the shadows had a life of their own. They were connected to something deeper, something buried in the woods, something old and hungry. Luke backed away, eyes locked on the movement at the edge of the trees. "What the hell is that?" A figure appeared between the trunks, a tall, slender shape, its form shifting in and out of focus. The shadows bent and twisted as it approached. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything they could name. And then, in a low, guttural voice that echoed in their minds, it spoke. "You are mine now." The ground trembled beneath their feet, and with a scream, Sarah stumbled backward. Ethan reached for her, but his own shadow wrapped around his leg, pulling him down, twisting him into the dirt. He fought it, struggled, but the shadows were stronger. They wrapped around his arms, his neck, pulling him deeper into the earth. Luke tried to run, but his shadow, his own damn shadow, stayed behind, slowly crawling after him, tugging at him like a chain. The last thing they saw before the darkness took them was the fire, flickering out, and the shadows, alive, ever moving and hungry. The next morning, the campsite was quiet. The wind rustled the trees, and the sun bathed the forest in an early, golden light. But there was no sign of Ethan, Sarah, or Luke. Only the faintest marks in the dirt, as if something had been dragged toward the woods. And if you listened carefully, you could hear the whispers, barely audible over the breeze, echoing from the forest. We're still waiting. Story 5. The last tent. The campfire crackled, the smoke swirling in the cold autumn air. The group sat in a loose circle around it, their faces lit by the flickering orange glow. The forest stood silent around them, a mass of shadows pressed together by the weight of the night. A cold wind pushed through the trees, rustling the leaves like whispers. Ranger Jack Taylor leaned back in his folding chair, his eyes squinting at the fire. He had been around long enough to know when the night felt like it was about to turn wrong. He had seen enough to understand the quiet moments before something happened, before the land gave up its secrets. Tonight, he wasn't going to let the others get away with their curiosity. "You want to hear a story?" Jack asked, his voice low but steady. His eyes met theirs, and a shiver ran through the group, though none of them admitted it. They all nodded, the firelight dancing across their faces. Some of them were seasoned campers. Others were new to the wilderness. It didn't matter. When a ranger spoke in these parts, you listened, especially Jack Taylor, who had been working these woods for over 15 years. There were things about this place that most people didn't know. Every year, Jack began, the crackle of the fire filling the gaps in his words. There's a camper who goes missing. Same spot, same time, like clockwork. The group shifted, uneasy. One of them, a young guy named Steve, tried to laugh it off. "Come on, man. You can't be serious. People go missing all the time in the woods." Jack's eyes narrowed. "Not like this. Not in that spot." He paused, letting the silence linger before continuing. The fire popped, sending a sudden flare of light into the night. "It's been going on for decades. The last tent on the North Trail. It's always the last campsite before the real deep woods begin. The one right before you get to the old hunting grounds. No one knows why, but every year someone pitches their tent there and disappears. It's like the place swallows them up." The wind howled as if on cue, a gust that made the trees bend and creak. A nervous laugh escaped from one of the campers, but it didn't last long. Jack shifted his weight, his voice softening as he leaned forward. "They find the tent every time, every single time, empty, just like it was set up an hour ago. The fire pit's still warm. The sleeping bags are rolled out. The food's half opened, but there's no sign of the person. Not a shoe, not a sock, nothing." The group fell quiet. The flames flickered like they were listening too. "And it happens like clockwork," Jack went on, his eyes scanning the faces around him. "A person goes missing, and we search. We find nothing. No tracks. No signs of a struggle. It's like they just vanish into thin air. The rangers know better than to get too close. There's something about that spot that calls to people. You can feel it when you're there. That weird, unsettling calm, like something's watching you from the trees." He leaned back in his chair, staring into the fire, his face hard with experience. "I've been there twice. I don't go near it anymore. Not after what happened to the last guy who was brave enough to look around for more than 5 minutes." "What happened?" Steve asked, his voice trembling now. Jack didn't answer right away. He let the question hang in the air, heavy and thick, like fog rolling in over a lake. Finally, he spoke, his voice a whisper that barely carried over the crackling fire. "We found his tent a week later, just like the others. But there was something different about it. His stuff was still there, but the tent was torn, not by wind, not by animals. It was shredded, like something had ripped it apart from the inside. And there was a trail leading away from the camp, a trail of ash. The group leaned in, hanging on every word. Jack's face was shadowed now, his features hard to make out in the dim light of the fire. We followed it for hours, but it just stopped in the middle of nowhere. No footprints, no sign of anything, like the guy had just been erased. And that's the thing, you never find any remains, never a body. It's like whatever it takes to make sure they're gone. Jack stood up, stretching his back. The fire seemed to dim a little, the shadows growing darker in the trees around them. "I'm telling you," he said, his voice taking on a darker edge. "If you're camping out here, stay away from the North Trail. Don't go near the last tent. You might think it's just another camping spot, but you'll be the one who disappears next." With that, Jack turned and walked into the darkness, leaving the campers to stew in the silence of the woods. The wind whispered through the trees again, and in the distance, someone called out, a faint voice in the night. Story 6. Static in the air. The old cabin by the lake had seen better days. It had creaked and groaned under the weight of time, its paint peeling like layers of forgotten memories. But for Greg, Marissa, Tim, and Sarah, it was perfect. They didn't come for luxury, they came for peace. The world outside was loud and chaotic. Here, tucked away in the woods, they could forget about everything, if only for the weekend. The first night, the fire crackled in the stone pit, and the sky above glittered with stars. The smell of pine hung thick in the air, and the sound of the lake lapping gently against the shore was soothing. They talked, drank beer, and told stories, the usual kind, light-hearted and easy. But there was something about the stillness of the place that made everything feel just a little too quiet. Greg was the one who found the radio. It was tucked away in the corner of the cabin, half hidden beneath a dusty sheet. The kind of old radio you'd find in an attic, the knobs worn smooth from decades of use. It looked like something out of a 1950s movie. Curious, Greg plugged it in and turned the knob. The dial cracked and popped as he tuned through the frequencies. At first, it was just static, faint whispers that seemed to float in the air, bouncing off the walls. It wasn't much, just the kind of noise you'd expect from an old radio, nothing to be concerned about. But then it happened. The static shifted. A voice cut through, faint and distorted. Greg froze, pressing his ear closer to the speaker. "Help! Help us!" The voice rasped, like someone speaking from the other side of a heavy door, muffled and broken. "Did you hear that?" Marissa asked, leaning in to listen. Greg turned the knob, trying to tune it out, but the voice grew louder, clearer. We are here, trapped." The others fell silent, staring at the radio. It wasn't possible. No one was broadcasting, not this far out in the woods. Yet, the voice continued, as if pleading, reaching for them from somewhere unseen. "Who is that?" Tim asked, his voice tight. "What's going on?" Greg's fingers hovered over the dial. The voice kept coming, now more urgent, more frantic. "Help get out. Get out now." The air in the cabin seemed to thicken. The temperature dropped, the warm glow of the fire flickering erratically, casting long shadows across the room. Sarah shivered, clutching her jacket tighter. Something didn't feel right. "Turn it off, Greg," she said, her voice trembling. "Turn it off now." Greg's hand shook as he twisted the knob, but the voice didn't stop. It only grew louder until it was a constant roar, like the buzzing of 1,000 angry bees, filling the room with a low, vibrating hum. Then, with a sudden, sharp crackle, the sound cut off. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then it came from outside, from the trees, came a sound, a low, guttural rumble, like something heavy scraping across the ground. The cabin shook, a deep, low vibration that made the walls groan and the floorboards creak. Tim grabbed a flashlight from his bag, his hand shaking, and flicked it on. It was as if the forest itself had come alive, the very air charged with something wrong. Greg stood frozen, the radio still in his hands, but the voice was gone. All that was left was the static, a swirling, maddening static that seemed to fill the cabin with a sense of dread. And then something else, a low, whispering hum, not from the radio, but from outside. It was as if the very air had become alive, thick with something unseen, something waiting. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with fear. Tim nodded slowly. "We need to leave. Now." But it was too late. The door burst open, slamming against the wall. Standing there, at the threshold, were figures, tall, thin, and impossibly pale. Their skin gleamed in the dim light, their eyes wide and unblinking. They didn't walk. They glided, moving as though the air itself parted for them, their limbs unnaturally long. One of them tilted its head, and in the eerie silence, a voice, not the voice from the radio, but the same sound that had been in the air, spoke. "You heard us. You found us. Now you belong." Greg felt his breath catch in his throat. There was no escape. The things in the doorway were not human. They were something else, something that had waited, trapped in the static, reaching out through the radio for anyone who dared to listen. The door slammed shut behind them, trapping them inside with the creatures. The radio hummed once more, louder than before, as if it had never stopped. And in the distance, deep in the woods, the trees began to whisper. Story 7. Campfire packed. The fire crackled, sending occasional sparks into the cool night air as the group of 6 sat huddled around it. The sky above them was a deep velvet black, dotted with stars like a scattered handful of diamonds. They had set up camp in the woods outside a small town, a place they'd chosen for its remoteness. The moon was a sliver, barely a hint of light, and the darkness around them seemed to lean in, as if it were listening. Sammy, the one who had convinced everyone to come out here, looked around the group with a sly grin. His hair was messy, and his eyes glinted with the promise of something mischievous. "All right, people, he said, adjusting himself on his log. Time for the scariest ghost story you've ever heard. The others groaned, but it was the kind of groan that came from a place of anticipation. They were ready. It had been a quiet evening, the only sound the rustling of leaves and the gentle breeze. They needed something to spice it up. Jess, his girlfriend, who had been digging through her bag for a snack, rolled her eyes. "Oh, please, Sammy, don't go all scary ghosts on us. We're out here to have fun, not to piss ourselves." Sammy leaned in, eyes wide, voice dropping low. "You want to hear something real, Jess? Something that'll make your blood run cold." "You're insane," she replied, but she settled back, intrigued despite herself. The fire's orange glow danced in their faces as Sammy started the story. His voice became deeper, more deliberate, as he spoke, drawing the group in. "It was 15 years ago, a group of college kids just like us," Sammy said. "They came up to these very woods for their annual camping trip, out to the site just past the old mill. You know, the one that's been abandoned for decades. They didn't care about the legends or the warnings. Kids, right? They always think they know better." Jess raised an eyebrow. "Are we supposed to care about some old legends?" "You'll see," Sammy said, flashing a grin. "The story goes like this. There's a spirit, a ghost that haunts this place. Not the usual kind, the kind you can just see out of the corner of your eye or hear whispering in the wind. No, this spirit is active. It's powerful. A powerful ghost." Mark, sitting on a log beside Sammy, let out a chuckle. "Well, like it picks up rocks and throws them at you." Sammy shot him a glare. "Not rocks, Mark. Worse. Much worse." The fire crackled again, and they all leaned in closer, the shadows flickering on their faces. "This spirit," Sammy continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "was once a man named Willard Graves. Back when the mill was still running, Graves was the foreman. He was a hard man, mean, cruel. They say he treated the workers like animals. Anyone who complained about the hours or the conditions, well, they disappeared. But there was a legend, the legend of the campfire pact." Sammy paused for effect, making sure everyone was listening. "You see," he went on, "Graves had a deal with something darker than he ever realized. A demon, a creature that lived in the woods, older than the trees themselves. Every year, Graves would make a pact. He'd offer up a sacrifice, a life, a soul, to keep the mill running, to keep things prosperous. The locals never saw it coming until they did, and by then, it was too late. What kind of sacrifice?" Jess asked, her voice small, intrigued despite herself. "A person," Sammy replied, his eyes narrowing. "A life, a soul. Usually it was a worker from the mill, someone who had no family or connections. Graves would bring them out here, to the campfire, make them swear an oath, never to speak of the pact, never to tell anyone about what they had seen or heard. And then, well, then the creature would take them." Sammy looked around at the group, making sure they were all still with him. "One year, a group of workers decided enough was enough. They were going to confront Graves, stop the killings. They showed up here, in these very woods, ready to end the madness. But Graves had been prepared. He tricked them into making the pact themselves. A chill ran down Jess's spine, but she masked it with a laugh. This is a ghost story, right? Like there's no actual ghost or anything, right? Oh, there's a ghost all right, Sammy said, his voice dropping even lower. And the worst part is the pact is still active. The ghost, the spirit of Willard Graves, still roams these woods, waiting for someone to make the same mistake. All it takes is a simple promise, a vow spoken in the dark. There was a long silence. The wind rustled the branches above them, and the fire popped. The flames twisted and curled in odd patterns, casting flickering shadows over their faces. A moment of tension hung in the air, thick and uncomfortable. So, Mark said, breaking the silence, "What? You're saying if we say the wrong thing around the fire, we're going to summon this ghost?" "Exactly," Sammy said, looking at them seriously. "You joke about the pact, you make light of it, and it becomes real. The ghost will hear you, and then it's too late." Everyone laughed uneasily, but there was a nervous edge to it. They weren't sure if Sammy was serious or just messing with them. "That's ridiculous," Jess scoffed, but there was a slight tremor in her voice. "Is it?" Sammy's eyes gleamed. "You want to test it?" "Fine," Jess said, rolling her eyes. "Let's make a stupid pact. Whatever. We swear to never tell anyone about this ghost story." "Done." Everyone else laughed, but Sammy didn't. He stared at the fire, his face unreadable. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then, with an almost imperceptible nod, he stood and threw a stick into the flames. "You sure about that?" Sammy asked, his voice a low murmur. "What's the worst that could happen?" Mark said, standing up and brushing the dirt off his pants. "You really think some ghost is going to show up?" "I wouldn't joke about it," Sammy said, his voice turning cold. "I'm not messing around. If you made the pact, you're bound to it now, and you'll pay the price." "All right, that's enough," Jess said, a nervous laugh escaping her. "Let's just go to bed, okay? It's just a story." But even as she spoke, there was an unease in the air, a tension that wasn't there before. The night had grown colder. The wind seemed to carry whispers. Later, as they all climbed into their tents, the forest outside remained eerily still. No more rustling leaves. No more distant calls of animals. Just an unnerving silence. Jess tried to sleep, but something gnawed at the edges of her mind. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. The air felt thicker, as if the very space around her had become charged with an unseen presence. It wasn't until she heard it, that sound, so faint at first, so soft, that she sat up in her tent, heart pounding in her chest. The sound was barely perceptible, like a whisper on the wind, but it was growing louder. Willard Graves. The words were unmistakable. They were soft, hushed, but there was no mistaking them. Jess froze. Her breath caught in her throat. Willard Graves. The voice was right outside her tent now, The others had heard it too. They stumbled out of their tents, eyes wide with panic. Mark was the first to speak, his voice trembling. "What the hell is that?" "That's the voice," Sammy whispered, his face pale. "The spirit. It's come for us." Jess could see it then, just beyond the campfire's light. A shadow, tall and twisted, moving with an unnatural fluidity. The creature that had once been Graves had returned. They had made the pact, and now they would pay. Story 8. Blood Moon Trail. It was supposed to be just another weekend trip, a chance to escape the daily grind, to leave behind the hum of city life, and let the vastness of the forest soothe their nerves. Sam and Anna had been together for 3 years now, and they'd both agreed that hiking was the perfect way to reset. The fact that a rare blood moon would rise that evening only added a touch of excitement to their plans. It was the sort of thing people would talk about for weeks, and they could be among the lucky few to witness it in all its eerie glory. The trail they'd chosen, known as the Blood Moon Trail, was a place of legend. It wasn't popular, not like the more well-trodden paths that looped around the nearby park, but it had its stories. Stories that Sam laughed off. Ghosts, strange creatures lurking in the woods, and tales of people who'd gone missing without a trace. Anna, on the other hand, was intrigued by it all. She had a love for the weird and unexplained. Sam was the skeptic, the one who rolled his eyes at the talk of hauntings and strange forces at work. They started their hike at noon, the sun hanging high in the sky, its rays filtering through the thick canopy of trees. The trail was quiet, just the sound of crunching leaves beneath their boots and the occasional bird call. Sam carried the pack, loaded with camping gear, while Anna took photos of the scenery, her camera clicking at every turn. The deeper they went into the forest, the quieter it became. The trees grew denser, their branches thick with moss and ivy, blocking out the sun and casting long shadows on the ground. Anna couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them, though Sam dismissed it as nothing more than the weight of the place. It wasn't uncommon for a dense forest to feel a little off. As the day stretched on, the air grew thicker, the temperature cooler. They reached the campsite around 4, a small clearing just off the trail. Sam set up their tent while Anna gathered firewood. The blood moon would rise around 8, and they had time to kill. They lit a fire, the crackling flames a comforting sound amidst the stillness of the woods. Sam pulled out his phone to check the weather forecast, but the signal was spotty, flickering between 1 bar and none at all. Anna, still intrigued by the trail's ominous reputation, began flipping through a guidebook she'd found at the visitor center. "There's something weird about this place," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. Sam glanced up from his phone. "You've been reading those dumb stories again, haven't you?" Anna smiled. "Maybe, but listen to this one. The creatures of the Blood Moon Trail are said to awaken under the light of a blood-red moon. They are not ghosts, but something older, something that preys on the living. They only come out on nights like tonight." Sam chuckled and shook his head. "You're letting your imagination get the best of you. It's just a lunar eclipse." No monsters, no creatures. But as the day began to shift into evening, Sam couldn't help but feel a strange unease settle in his chest. The forest seemed to grow quieter, the wind stilled, and the shadows darker. The only sound was the crackle of their campfire, as the blood moon began to rise, casting its eerie red glow over the forest. Anna stood at the edge of the clearing, gazing up at the sky. Sam joined her, his breath catching in his throat as he stared at the moon, bigger and redder than he'd ever seen it before. "It's beautiful," Anna whispered, but Sam couldn't shake the growing sense of dread. It was as if the very air had changed, thickened, turned heavier. His eyes darted around the clearing, his nerves on edge. It wasn't just the moon, it was the silence, the unnatural quiet that had settled in the woods. "I'm going to take a walk," Sam said abruptly, grabbing his flashlight from the tent. He didn't wait for Anna to respond, just turned and walked back toward the trail. "Sam, don't go too far," Anna called after him, but Sam didn't hear. Or maybe he didn't want to hear. The trail stretched before him, dark and shadowed by the trees. The flashlight beam bounced off the trunks, casting long, twisted shadows on the ground. The air was thick with the smell of pine and damp earth. He walked for a few minutes, hoping the motion would shake off the unsettling feeling that had settled in his chest. But the deeper he went into the woods, the more the feeling grew. He felt eyes on him. At first, it was just a twitch in the corner of his vision, a flicker of movement behind a tree. But when he stopped and turned, there was nothing there. He laughed at himself, just his mind playing tricks, he thought. But he couldn't shake the feeling. The hair on the back of his neck stood on end. The woods were too quiet, too still. Then he heard it, a rustling, a movement in the bushes behind him. Sam froze. His heart pounded in his chest as he turned to look, the beam of his flashlight sweeping over the underbrush. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, just beyond the trees, he saw something, shapes, moving in the shadows. He stepped back, his breath quickening, his pulse racing. "Hello?" he called out, his voice trembling. There was no answer, only the rustling, growing louder now. And then he saw them, figures tall and thin, emerging from the darkness. They were humanoid, but wrong, too thin, their limbs stretching unnaturally long, their skin pale and sickly. Their faces were obscured by shadow, but Sam could feel their eyes on him, cold, empty eyes that seemed to pierce through him. Panic surged through him. He turned to run, but his legs wouldn't move. It was as if the very earth beneath him was holding him in place. He tried again, his heart pounding in his chest, but it was no use. Then he heard it, a whisper, low and guttural, curling through the air like a snake. "You should not have come." The creatures stepped closer, their movements jerky and unnatural. Sam screamed, struggling to break free, but it was too late. One of them reached out, its fingers long and clawed, grabbing his wrist in a vice-like grip. Anna, she had to be somewhere. She was waiting for him, With a final burst of strength, Sam yanked himself free. He stumbled back toward the campsite, his heart racing, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. He didn't stop running until he reached the clearing, where Anna was standing by the fire, her eyes wide with concern. "Sam, what's wrong?" He couldn't answer. The creatures were behind him, just at the edge of the clearing, their long, shadowy figures stretching toward him. The blood moon hung high above them, casting its eerie red light over the forest. "Run," Sam gasped. "Run now." Anna didn't hesitate. She grabbed his hand, and they ran, the sound of their footsteps drowned out by the growl of the creatures pursuing them. They ran until their legs burned, until the trees seemed to close in on them, until the world around them blurred. They didn't stop until they reached the edge of the trail. And even then, they kept running, never looking back. The creatures of the Blood Moon Trail were patient. They always waited for the right moment. And when the blood moon rose again, they would awaken once more. Story 9. The Singing Tree. It was the kind of summer that promised adventures. Hot days and cool nights. A time when the forest felt alive with the hum of cicadas and the whisper of the wind through the trees. A time when children ran wild, their laughter mixing with the chirp of crickets. But for the Johnson family, this summer would be different. The family was camping in the same forest they always visited, a sprawling wilderness of pines and oaks, a place that had become a second home. They'd been coming here for years, back when the kids were younger, when their mother was still alive. Now it was just Tom and his two children, Max, 13, and Lily, 9. They hadn't come since their mother passed. Tom had wanted to keep the tradition alive, but there was something about this place that felt heavier without her. Still, he pushed forward, determined to give his kids some semblance of normalcy. They arrived on a warm Saturday afternoon, the sunlight dappling through the trees as they set up camp near the familiar clearing. The tents were pitched, the firewood gathered, and the smells of hot dogs and marshmallows filled the air. But as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky deepened into a velvety purple, something felt off. Max was the first to notice it. He had always been more sensitive to the quiet shifts in the atmosphere, the kind of kid who didn't like silence in the woods. He was sitting by the fire, roasting a marshmallow, when he heard it, a faint sound, like the wind itself was singing. He froze, staring into the dark forest. "Did you hear that?" Max asked, his voice a little too sharp. Tom glanced up, his brow furrowing. "Hear what?" Max looked at Lily, who was busy playing with a flashlight. "It sounded like singing. Lily giggled. "You mean like a bird?" "No, not like a bird." Max shook his head, his eyes narrowing. "It was like a lullaby." Tom gave a dismissive laugh, trying to keep the mood light. "It's probably just the wind. Things can sound funny out here." Max wasn't so sure. There was something too melodic about it, something too human, but he didn't press it. He knew how his dad got when he asked too many questions. As night deepened, the family huddled around the fire, the flickering flames casting long, crooked shadows on the forest floor. Max couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them, lurking just beyond the firelight. And that song, it was still there like a soft hum just on the edge of hearing. A lullaby, but not one he recognized. It was as though the forest itself was singing it to him. Later that night, after the fire had died down and the only sound was the rustling of the trees in the breeze, Lily asked a question that made Max's heart race. "Daddy," she said, her voice small and curious, "what's that tree over there?" Tom had already noticed the tree, though he hadn't said anything. It was out of place, too tall, too wide, and it stood alone in the middle of the clearing, its gnarled branches stretching toward the sky like twisted fingers. It was almost too perfect. Its bark was dark and smooth, unlike the rough, weathered trees surrounding it. Max stared at it too, his chest tightening. It was the only thing in the clearing that seemed to move with the wind, its branches swaying slightly as if something invisible was pulling them. Tom stood up and glanced over his shoulder at the tree. "That old thing? It's just a tree, kids. Don't worry about it." But Lily's eyes were wide, and she was staring at the tree intently. "It looks like it's waiting for us," she whispered. Tom smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. He didn't like the way Lily spoke about the tree. He'd heard stories, local legends, whispered among the older campers about a cursed tree deep in the woods, one that called the children at night with a song. He thought it was just superstition, stories designed to scare kids. But there was something about Lily's gaze, so fixated on the tree, that made him uneasy. Max could feel it too. A cold shiver ran down his spine. Something wasn't right, but he didn't say anything. He just went to bed, hoping that when he woke up, everything would feel normal again. But when he woke up, it wasn't normal. The sun had barely risen, but Max was already awake, his mind buzzing with the memory of the night. The lullaby had been louder, more insistent. He had dreamed of the tree, standing in the middle of the clearing, its branches reaching for him, its roots deep in the earth, pulling at him, calling him closer. Max slid out of his sleeping bag, careful not to wake his father or Lily. He crept outside, drawn by an invisible pull. The air was still, the usual hum of morning wildlife absent. Only the faintest echo of that haunting lullaby remained, growing stronger as he moved toward the tree. The moment Max stepped into the clearing, he felt it, the change in the air, the heaviness that hung over the ground. The tree seemed to grow taller, more imposing as he approached. It was as though it recognized him, as though it had been waiting for him all along. "Max!" Lily's voice broke through the fog in his mind. He turned, startled, and saw his sister standing just outside the clearing. Her eyes were wide, filled with a mix of fear and curiosity. "Don't come any closer," Max said hoarsely, his voice shaky. "There's something wrong with that tree." Lily hesitated, then took a few slow steps toward him. "I hear it too, Max. The singing, it's calling us." Max's heart hammered in his chest. He wanted to run, to pull her away from the tree, but he couldn't move. It was as though the air itself had turned to quicksand, pulling him in, holding him there. Lily stepped forward, her small hands reaching out toward the tree. Max lunged forward, grabbing her wrist. Lily, no. We have to go back. But it was too late. With a sudden snap, the branches of the tree reached down, wrapping around Lily's arm. She screamed, her voice high-pitched with terror, but the tree pulled her closer. Max tried to pull her back, but the tree's grip was too strong. Daddy, Lily screamed again, her feet lifting off the ground as the tree began to drag her up. Tom rushed out of the tent, his eyes wild with fear. Lily, but Max could only watch in horror as the tree's branches wrapped around his sister like a vice, drawing her into the dark, hollow center of the trunk. The lullaby grew louder, more insistent, and Max felt his own body stiffen, as if the tree was trying to pull him into its grasp as well. No, Max shouted, his voice breaking, as he yanked Lily away from the tree with all his strength. Suddenly, the grip on Lily loosened. She fell backward into Max's arms, both of them tumbling to the ground. The tree, now eerily still, seemed to shudder, and the song stopped. Tom reached them, his face pale with fear. What the hell is going on? He demanded, looking at the tree with wide eyes. Max didn't answer. He couldn't. All he could hear was the sound of the lullaby echoing in his head. And he knew, deep down, that the tree wasn't finished with him yet. It had only just begun. Story 10. The Forgotten Campground. It started with a wrong turn, something as innocent as a missed sign, but it was enough to lead them straight into the heart of something terrible. They had been driving for hours, the long stretch of highway, giving way to winding back roads that sliced through dense forest. The storm had been brewing for a while, gray clouds swirling above like a slow-moving beast, thunder grumbling in the distance. But it wasn't until the first raindrops fell that Jason, the driver, had realized they were off course. I swear we should have hit the campground by now, he muttered, wiping rain from the windshield. He turned to look at the others, his two best friends, Ben, the quiet, cautious one, and Sarah, the level-headed one who was always ready with a solution. Maybe we took a wrong exit, Sarah said, peering at the map on her lap. This road's not even on here. Ben stared out the window at the thick, dark woods. It doesn't feel right, he muttered. This place is too quiet. We should have seen something by now. A sign, a marker. Sarah shrugged. We'll get there. Just a little longer. Jason squinted through the windshield, but all he could see was a wall of trees. His GPS had gone haywire long before they'd left the main highway, the signal cutting out as soon as they'd entered the woods. The storm was only getting worse, with the rain now beating heavily against the roof of the car. He wasn't sure what was worse, getting lost in the wilderness or dealing with the growing unease in the pit of his stomach. Ben, who was sitting in the back seat, suddenly tensed up. Look up ahead. That's a road sign. Jason leaned forward, peering out the window. The sign, half hidden by trees, was rusted and worn. It was hard to make out, but he could just read the words. Forgotten Campground, 3 miles. Forgotten Campground? Jason said, laughing a little. "That's an odd name." "No kidding," Ben replied, eyeing the road ahead with suspicion. "It's not on the map either." But with the storm intensifying and no other options in sight, Jason shrugged. "We need shelter. Let's give it a shot." The road was narrow and winding, the trees leaning in on them like dark sentinels. The car bumped and jostled over the uneven ground, the tires slipping on patches of mud. After a few minutes, they rounded a corner and saw it, the entrance to the forgotten campground. It looked abandoned. The iron gates were rusted shut, and the wooden sign that marked the entrance hung askew, its letters barely visible through the thick rain. But there was an unmistakable sense of desolation about it, a place that had been forgotten by time and people alike. "Well, this is welcoming," Ben said dryly. "It'll have to do," Jason said. He pulled the car off the road and parked near a dilapidated cabin. The rain was coming down in sheets now, and the wind howled through the trees. The storm was no longer just an inconvenience. It was a force of nature, relentless and all-encompassing. They gathered their things and stepped out into the downpour. The air smelled of wet earth and decaying wood, a damp, musty odor that seemed to hang in the air like a warning. "Let's get inside before we drown," Jason said, leading the way. The cabin they found wasn't much better than the rest of the campground. The wooden walls were cracked and peeling, the roof sagging with age. But it was dry, and that was enough. They settled in, pulling out sleeping bags and making themselves comfortable by the fire that Sarah had managed to light in the crumbling fireplace. The storm raged outside, but inside, it felt like they were in their own little world, safe from whatever chaos was happening out there. For a while, they were just three friends, sitting in front of a fire, talking about old memories and laughing at jokes that weren't quite as funny as they remembered. The storm kept them inside, and they embraced the quiet. But as the hours dragged on, the unease that had been building since they'd arrived began to grow. "I don't like this place," Ben said, his voice low. He was sitting in the far corner, staring out the window at the storm. "It feels wrong." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked, her voice gentle. Ben hesitated. "I don't know. It's just it doesn't feel right. Like we're not supposed to be here." Jason frowned. "We're just here to wait out the storm. It's fine." But Ben wasn't so sure. His eyes kept darting to the dark shadows outside the window, and every now and then he would glance at the door as though expecting someone or something to knock. It wasn't long before the first strange thing happened. The rain had slowed down, and the wind had died down enough for them to hear something faint, something like a scratching sound coming from the direction of the woods. Jason got up to check it out, but found nothing, just the trees swaying in the breeze. But when he returned to the cabin, Sarah and Ben were both staring at the door. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered. Her voice was tight, like she was trying not to breathe too loudly. "Hear what?" Jason asked, glancing at the door. Ben swallowed hard. "Someone's out there." They all froze. The silence in the cabin seemed to press down on them like a heavy weight. Suddenly, There was another sound, this time louder, more distinct. A knock on the door. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible, but then it came again, louder this time. 3 knocks. Ben's eyes were wide with terror. "Who's out there?" he whispered. Jason's hand trembled as he reached for the door handle. "Stay here," he said, though his voice sounded uncertain even to himself. He pulled the door open, but there was nothing. Just the dark woods stretching out in all directions. The only sound the soft rustling of leaves. The storm had picked up again, but there was no sign of anyone. Jason stepped outside, heart pounding in his chest, but there was nothing. Only the oppressive, suffocating silence. Then, as he turned to go back inside, he saw it. A figure standing just beyond the tree line, partially obscured by the trees. The figure was tall, thin, with limbs that seemed to stretch and bend unnaturally, like something that didn't belong. It was watching him, unmoving. Jason froze. "Who are you?" he called out, but the figure didn't respond. It didn't even move. Suddenly, the air around him felt thick with something foul, like the smell of decay. His stomach churned as a sense of dread washed over him, an overwhelming feeling that he was no longer in control of the situation. Without thinking, he slammed the door shut and turned the lock. Inside, Ben and Sarah were both wide-eyed, staring at him. "We need to leave," Jason said, his voice shaking. "Now." But it was too late. The sound of scratching had returned, louder this time. It came from the walls, from the floorboards beneath their feet. Someone was trying to get in. And then, from somewhere deep in the woods, came a sound that sent a chill down their spines. A low, guttural scream. Human, but not quite. The kind of scream you only hear in nightmares. The storm was no longer the only thing they had to fear.